Welcome back, everybody. Today we are going to be talking about the early industrial revolution, the dawn of industry, Britain's industrial ascendancy, 1750 to 1830. The question that we will be taking up is, how did technological advancements during the Industrial Revolution unlock unprecedented economic potential and reshape Britain into an industrial powerhouse? So grab your pen and paper, a tablet, a keyboard, and let's jump into the lecture. So we've been talking about revolutions for quite a while. We've been talking about the French Revolution, the Enlightenment, some important political developments. And so we're going to change gears a bit here. We're looking at subjects that are more related to the economy and society, but subjects that are just as profound as the French Revolution. They both get the title of revolution, but in many ways the Industrial Revolution is even more significant. So, as far as like changing the way that society lives, economically, we talk about socially, we talk about environmentally, just incredibly profound effects. But the two of these together, the French and Industrial Revolution, are going to be some of the most important and transformative movements in Europe and really around the world as we go into the 19th century. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about what came before. We're going to talk about the agrarian roots. For most of recorded human history, people have farmed as their primary occupation. Farming life is very dependent on the seasons. And so there's the growing season, the harvesting season, the winter season, planting season, the cycles of the sun, morning and evening, rain patterns. These are all really how agricultural workers organize their lives. Of course, working on a farm is very labor intensive. There's a lot of manual labor. And whatever production there is of non-farm goods tends to be small scale. So, whether that's pottery or tool making or textiles, they're all pretty small scale, usually done at home. But by the 18th century, even prior to the Industrial Revolution, agriculture was undergoing some profound changes. New agricultural methods had been introduced. Things like crop rotation, all right. Some crops, like cereals, wheat, barley, corn, strip nitrates out of the soil. And so people knew this. People have known this for millennia. And so what they would tend not to do is they would tend to rotate their crops. They would plant for 2 years, and then they knew that you had to let the soil rest for a season, let the nutrients get back into the soil, and then you could plant again for 2 more years before having to give it a break. And so this form of crop rotation had been planted throughout the Middle Ages, and it was effective, but it wasn't the most efficient use, because obviously that meant at any given time 1/3 of Europe's most productive soil wasn't being used. And so people had learned that certain crops like lentils and peas could be planted in years when you were letting the soil rest, and that these crops actually not only allow you to grow for that year, but they actually help to put nitrates back into the soil. All right, so people's scientific understanding had advanced to the point that by the 18th century, they knew this. And so people were using their knowledge of science and beginning to put it to use in agriculture, and they were yielding bigger and bigger crop yields as a result of this. People also began to develop more sophisticated plow designs. They began to use things like the implement that is pictured here called the seed drill, which more scientifically places seed, spaces them out properly. It means that you don't have to plant as much seed. It means that you can use the same amount of seed and plant more crops with it. It means that the crops that do grow aren't going to choke each other out, and they're going to be bigger and they're going to be healthier. People had learned how to manipulate soils to make them more productive. They had learned fertilization techniques. They had learned how to better breed animals. And so the 18th century, even before the 19th century, was revolutionary just agriculturally. All right, bigger and bigger harvests, more and more efficient use, greater and greater surpluses. Now, many of these new inventions and these new techniques, as well as different ways of consolidating farms, meant that not only were you producing more food, but you actually needed less and less people to do the same job. And so what this meant is that many people who had been peasants were displaced from their land, especially in places like Britain, which was on the cutting edge of many of these innovations. And what you start to see is that many of these folks who were no longer able to find employment farming made their way into cities. And so the 18th century is a big time where there's population migration to European cities. These cities expand greatly. These, and as the populations grow, it means that these people need to buy food and other items, and so this creates more demand for not only crops, but it also is going to create more demand for some of the necessities of life that these people have. And so you have this situation where you have a growing population. We're able to feed this population now. You have more people, you have more surplus, you have more demand. And this is the situation of Europe, and particularly advanced places like Britain, around 1750. Well, agriculture and food is one of the most important necessities, right? Food, water, and the other one is clothing. More people meant a greater need for more clothing. Plus, this was a time when countries like Europe and other European powers were expanding as colonial empires. And so many of their subject peoples also were potential markets for clothing and other items to be sold. And so there was not only increased European demand, but increased global demand for European products. And as I said, textiles after food is going to be one of the most important things. Everybody needs clothing. And it's a necessity of life. And so in the 18th century, quite a few British tinkerers, I guess we would call them. They weren't really scientists. They weren't trained. They were people who were involved in textiles for the most part, and who cleverly came up with inventions that made the textile process more efficient. Now, textiles and making clothing, that's what textiles are, is a pretty complex process. Even in the Middle Ages, it was one of the most complex processes. There were many, many different stages to it, more than almost any other commodity that was produced. And so, you know, if you think about it, the raw materials, early on it was wool, had to be sheared from sheep, it had to be transported, had to be washed, it had to be dyed, it had to be cleaned, it had to, the wool then had to be carded, which is basically combed out, it needed to be spun, it needed to be woven. So it was a very, very complex process. And by the mid-18th century, there was a bit of a bottleneck in this process. Weavers, because of some earlier inventions, had gotten to the point, weavers, which is one of the latter stages of this process. Weaving is where you take a loom and you weave thread with it, and it creates the textile. Weavers had gotten pretty fast. It was one of the first areas to come up with some new techniques and new inventions. And so weavers were really, really fast at their job. Spinning, which is the process right before it, this is where you take the cleaned, combed sheep wool and you turn it into thread. That process was actually quite a bit slower at this point. All right. And so you have this situation which is developed where there's a lot of demand for clothing. The weavers are able to keep up with this demand, but spinners, the people who take these wheels, these old-fashioned wheels, you might have seen pictures of them. Usually it was women who did this work, and they would take the thread, they would take the wool, and they would turn it into thread, and then it would be sent off to the weavers. And so you have this backlog, right, where weavers are wanting more wool thread to weave, but they can't get it. And so in the picture in the upper left-hand corner is a picture of a device called a spinning jenny. I believe it was James Hargreaves who pioneered this invention, the spinning jenny. And basically what it allowed for is one person to spin a wheel with their arm, just crank a wheel, and it would allow them to do the task of 7 workers. And so you'd set up this machine, you'd get the wool, and you would just crank it with your arm, and you could do the work of 7 people. And so this was a pretty great invention. It wasn't anything too complicated, but, you know, Hargreaves had just seen this need, and he had met the demand. And so these became very popular. And people tried to keep adding to them, add more spools, but they ran into a problem. And the problem is that there was only just so much power that one person could generate with their arm. And plus their arms would get tired, and then, you'd probably end up with asymmetries. You'd end up with one gigantic arm and one atrophied arm. And so a different inventor, a guy by the name of Richard Arkwright, came up with the idea of attaching the wheel to a water wheel. And that way, you could use the power of water, which is obviously a lot stronger than a human. It doesn't tire. And you could set that up, and you could crank out a lot of these spools. I think his original one had something like 95 spools or something. And so if you invested and you bought this one machine, you could do the work of essentially 100 people. And so the spinning of wool became a really, really mechanized process. And the weavers now had all of the necessary thread that they needed. And now they were the bottleneck in the process. And so a man by the name of Edmund Cartwright mechanized this process. He created, you can see this in the lower right-hand corner, he created this device that would mechanize the weaving process. And so now you have big stages of this textile production, which is, again, one of the most important manufactured items that humans use. There's next to universal demand for it. And so you have this entire process now being mechanized. You also see the introduction of a new raw material. Throughout most of European history, wool has been the primary ingredient in textiles. But through their colonies in Egypt, the British had come across cotton. They had begun to use cotton. They had begun to import cotton. Cotton was lighter. Cotton is a plant material. And so it's ultimately going to be cheaper. It's easier to dye. It's easier to print on. Superior in many ways. And then with their colonies in the American South, they had another place where they could grow this cotton. The problem with cotton was that it was difficult to use at its initial stages because it had seeds and it had burrs and various other things in it. And it was an American inventor this time, a man that many of you probably know, Eli Whitney, who came up with the cotton gin. Again, it's a simple invention, but what this allowed for was this allowed for people to import cotton on one side, and you crank this out, and it got all the seeds out. And so now you had this process mechanized. And so what you end up with is the British taking a gigantic leap, you know, through their colonies, and later, even once the American colonies separate, they still keep close trade relations with the American South. And you have Britain, who is now leading the way in the manufacture of textiles. And so this is the earliest industry to really see the beginnings of industrialization. And so what we start to see in Britain is we start to see a productivity surge. Right? If you've got machines doing the work that humans were previously doing, they can work all night. They can, they don't take breaks. They are faster. Their output is greater. You're using the power of water, at least at first, and you're mass producing textiles. And this is really going to significantly boost the amount of production that you have. And so we can see this chart here, how much productivity goes up in Great Britain. So obviously the mechanization of the textile industry is an important early step, and in many ways it is going to you know, once you come up with the idea of mechanizing one thing, there's no reason you can't mechanize other things too. But this productivity surge, because of mechanization, also coincides with a gigantic other development that dovetails into it, and that's a big shift in energy. And that's the use of fossil fuels for energy. And early on, it's going to be coal. As a matter of fact, coal is going to be used in places like Britain well before the 18th century, right into the late Middle Ages. Now, originally, in the earlier Middle Ages, people had used wood to heat their homes. But Britain is an island, and there's only so much wood, and as the population increased, people began to turn to coal, which at first was plentiful on the surface. Britain has good coal deposits, and people would find these hunks of coal, and they'd bring them home, and they would sell them, or they would sell them, or they would use them themselves. And coal became the most predominant source of energy in Great Britain during this time. And so, as we get to the 18th century, many Britons are burning coal in their home, and there's a whole coal industry. People now have to dig deep into the earth to get at the seams, as they're called, the locations where these coal deposits are underground. And so there's a coal industry that's emerged. But as you start to dig underground, you start to run into problems. And one of these problems is that the coal pits that miners will go down into begin to fill with water. This is a natural process, not only because of rain, but also because of underground aquifers and underground channels. These pits will fill with water. And so this would require you having to pump these pits out. And miners began to experiment with different ways to begin to mechanize this pumping process. And so they began to experiment with using the coal, usually the leftover coal that they were using, to begin to operate a simple pump. At first, these were pretty inefficient and pretty poorly designed, but a man by the name of James Watt, again a Brit, created the first workable engine. All right, and this engine would use the coal, and it would operate the pump, and it was fairly efficient for the time. Well, industrialists who were involved in the textile industry learned of this, and they saw the potential to use it in their own establishments. Water power was good, but it has its limitations. Sometimes the river is drier, and then the wheel won't operate. Sometimes the river freezes. Sometimes there's too much water, and then you can't operate it. And furthermore, having a water wheel meant that you had to go where the river was, a fast-moving river, which isn't always where people live. And so they realized that if you could apply Watt's steam engine to the textile process, remove the water wheel and replace it with a steam engine, well, then you could move production to where people lived. You wouldn't be inhibited by nature. Britain already had a well-developed coal industry for heating. And so you could have a steady supply of this raw material, coal. All right. And so people began to install these Watt steam engines and use them to operate their textile machines. At the same time, people began to think, they said, I wonder, what if we were to take this Watt steam engine, make a few alterations to it, and instead of churning a pump or churning a machine for textiles, what if we turned it into a steam engine? And we used it to move people and goods. And that's what they began to do. And I believe the man's name was Stephenson. He comes up with his first working model in around 1825. All right, this is the first really functional model. People already knew that if you laid down tracks that you could pull carts. The coal industry had used them extensively to pull carts. And so what Stephenson did is he laid down steel tracks put this machine on it, and he found that you could move goods and people really, really efficiently. All right. Now, at first, these these machines only went about 15 miles an hour. They were slow, they were clunky, they were inefficient. But it wasn't long before people were able to get these machines going up to like 50 miles an hour, which is a pretty decent speed. And of course, they were very powerful. They could pull a lot of merchandise. They could pull a lot of people, raw materials, coal, whatever it was that you needed to pull. And it enabled the linkage with the countryside. It enabled you to move people to work to further and further places. Obviously, all the machines and all the tracks and all the coal to build all of this was going to require a lot of people and a lot of workers. And so again, you have this infrastructure boom. The economy grows even more. Trade expands. It isn't long before most of the important cities of England are connected. Different parts of the countryside are connected. Coal pits are connected. And it becomes easy to center manufacturing in a few localities, like Liverpool or Manchester or London. And then to bring all of the inputs, the raw materials that you need, coal, iron, cotton, and begin to bring these to one central location, to have a population of workers there, and then to distribute them out into the countryside and even around the world, because it wouldn't be long before people started to put steam engines on boats as well. And so Britain becomes like a really like a network of sorts. It makes things cheaper. It makes travel easier. It makes drives down the cost of manufacturing things. And so there was really only one other important ingredient in this equation, and to really transform into an industrial society, and that was the creation of the factory. Now, earlier, going right back to the Middle Ages, earlier than that even, into ancient times, productivity was done at home. Throughout most of the ancient period and right into the Middle Ages, usually it was done in some sort of a town or some sort of a city. You would have people who would put a workshop of some sort onto the bottom floor of their house, and then they would live in the top floor. They might hire a servant or two, or they might hire a worker to help them out, who might live with them, and they would do it that way. By the 18th century, much of this productivity had moved out into the countryside, and this was to escape guild regulations. It was to tap into the growing population of people who weren't able to make it farming anymore, as the need for farmers began to dry up because of what we talked about earlier. And so, right across Europe, and especially in places like Britain, many people did some sort of weaving or spinning in their own homes. But as these new inventions came out, like the spinning jenny, and especially as people started to attach them first to water wheels and then to actual engines, well, this became impractical. To have a peasant in his home, it would be impractical to have every peasant have a machine in their home and then an engine to drive that machine. And obviously these things were very, very expensive, and so it no longer made sense to do it this way. And so what some enterprising entrepreneurs did is they began to centralize production in one place. You would invest in some land. You would build a facility on that land. You would invest in some engines to drive power. Maybe have a rail line that would come right up to your establishment. You would invest in the machines, and then what you would do is you would hire workers who would come to your facility, and they would become wage laborers. All right? And so what you start to see is the factory system develop. All right, this one centralized location where workers will come to work, they'll commute, and they will do the various stages of manufacturing in one place. And this proves to be much, much more efficient than the previous way. You can have the raw imports come in one place, the coal, the cotton, and you have finished goods come out the other end. A one-stop shop, so to speak. And it was easy to hire unskilled laborers because, unlike when peasants were doing it in their homes, really all you needed was someone to mind the machines. You needed what was called a hand. So that's all you really needed from them, was a hand to make sure that the machines were operating. And this whole process proved to be very, very efficient. As these factories begin to blossom in cities all across England and later in other places. And what we start to see is a massive productivity surge. In the early 1800s, Britain had a population that accounted for 2% of the global population. So they're a relatively small share of the global population. But overall productivity in Britain was close to 25%. So even though they only had 2% of the world's population, Britain was accounting for something like 25% of world productivity. And especially as they start to branch out and start to industrialize other processes like iron production and other areas. And Britain is going to begin to lay down the seeds early on here for its eventual global empire. It's going to become the workshop of the world, so to speak. Things are going to be made in Britain and sold around the world, and especially as their global empire begins to grow. And so what we end up with is a situation where Britain has these extensive trade networks that's going to link them around the world. They're going to use their shipping to pick up raw materials from their colonies and from other places that they have trade contacts with. They're going to get these raw materials from places like the American South, from places like India. They're going to import these into Britain, and then they're going to export these goods to places all around the world, especially now that they're able to make first these cheap textiles and then later other products. And we're going to start to see the beginning of Britain's trade dominance and the early signs of its global influence. Okay, well, what I would like you to do is I would like you to answer this question. How did technological advancements during the Industrial Revolution unlock unprecedented economic potential and reshape Britain into an industrial powerhouse? All right, I will see you next time, and until then, have a good day.